Hello, everyone.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining the call. Be sure to open up the doc and add your name to the attendees list. And if you have any other issues that you want to address in the agenda, please make sure to add them. Probably get started in a little bit. We're waiting on Josh and Hudson. I think.
Hi, everyone. So we got an exciting one today. I'm glad to see Bogdan's in the room. I drafted this agenda here and hope that people like it. The topic which I was thinking we would lead off with comes to us from the group at Amazon, which is led by Lolita and has a number of both full-time engineers and interns working on this project. Let's see, who do we have from that group on the call? I'm thinking Yang is probably here. Yes, I see you. So my hope was that we could lead off this meeting by getting some background on the project and the proposal, and then as we will see, there are several issues here that are related and problematic, and that's the real topic that I'd like us to discuss. So why don't we let Yang or one of the nominations from Lolita's group lead this off?
Sure, I can talk about it. This is Yang. So we're trying to build exporters to Cortex, which which is a open source multi-tenant storage for Prometheus. It originally takes data from Prometheus remote write API. So we're trying to support the direct export of metrics from OpenTelemetry to Cortex. And while we're doing this for the OpenTelemetry exporter, an issue we encountered is that the OTLP exporters are passed through, so the aggregation has to be done by the collector, whether it's like a processor or our exporter component. And currently, with like the OTLP receiver, Prometheus, which also accepts cumulative data, is not working properly. Counter values are exported to Prometheus as gauge, and our exporter would have the same problem. So we're thinking how we can address this issue, and where this aggregation should happen. We could put it in the collector, but then the problem is with multiple collectors behind a load balancer, like delta events from the same metric might not be aggregated at the same collector, and thus we would be exporting the wrong value to our backend. So our suggestion is to have OTLP export cumulative by default, so that we don't have to deal with so that the collector doesn't have to deal with this issue.
Quick question about this. Prometheus is switching to use open metrics, which has a concept of delta counters. Are you gonna have that support? Because that will solve half of the issues.
I'm not aware of
I don't, and I don't believe that support is actually integrated with Cortex in some way. I believe the Cortex remote write API that is used by Prometheus essentially requires cumulative values as stated today. It would not be able to apply deltas as the protocol stands from my read of it, because there's no notion of a start time. You just are passing timestamped cumulative values.
Yeah, I know how Prometheus worked before, but I was curious if Cortex intends to add support for start time, as Prometheus started to add that support with open metrics and stuff. So I was curious if that's a plan, and if we want to solve the problem for the current.
I'd love to know how that's going to be solved, and I haven't enough information at this time. It seems like if the remote write API were to take a timestamp, and then deltas could be done in a way that Cortex could hide a lot of complexity for us. Yeah, I think it would be possible to then support multiple collectors in a sort of naive way.
Sorry to interrupt. Should I get someone from the Cortex team on this call?
Oh, great.
Yeah, we can. Again, this is Aulita. Hi, Josh. We have reached out to the Cortex team. I don't think there is any plans of adding that immediately, and that's something that again may make more sense to be on the OT side anyway. So,
I mean, in general, if we can delegate work to others, it's the right thing.
Sure.
Yeah, no. I think there's a nice solution to this where Cortex absorbs this complexity, but it's definitely complexity that has to go somewhere.
Yeah.
I wanted to interject a hopefully not long statement here, but I guess I want to explain how we got here, and I realize it has to do with me, and there may be a bit of ideology that I'm ready to get to discard. But when we started trying to kind of integrate the world of Prometheus with StatsD, there was more of a practice in StatsD of just any label you want, just throw it in there, and you get to the point of worrying about high cardinality metrics. But you don't have the associated memory costs that you get with Prometheus of having those metrics. So when you export deltas, you're allowed to forget things, which enables high cardinality metrics in a way. When you have to report cumulatives, you're not allowed to forget anything, and that makes a memory problem. That basically prevents high cardinality metrics from existing. And I think it was probably some part of me just hoping to see the world move towards high cardinality metrics when I promoted some of these ideas, because I've seen that it's possible to support high cardinality, but it doesn't mean that we should break everything in the world just to do that. So at this point, the simple solutions that we've found for this problem at the moment are one is just to change OTLP to specify that you'll always get a cumulative value. That essentially makes status quo with the Prometheus exporter model. And it basically says you can't out of the box get high cardinality metrics without a memory leak, essentially. I would be okay with a change of stance that essentially changes the default, as long as there's a possibility that I can configure something the way I'd like to have not a memory problem and high cardinality support. That's good enough. So one idea was just change OTLP's default behavior to always go cumulative, has a memory cost. The other was require an agent in such a configuration. So if you have a single agent in the reporting path between your process and the backend, the agent is that single point that can easily convert deltas into cumulatives. And so that's a pretty onerous requirement for a user that doesn't want to have an agent. The users of StatSig are basically used to having agents if you look at the Datadog sort of customers, but it doesn't mean that we want to force people to do that. So those are the only two easy solutions that don't involve some sort of synchronization between the pool of collectors behind a load balancer, which I don't want us to require.
Josh.
So the summary is I'm willing to back off on this high cardinality metric stuff and say that maybe the default should be cumulative.
Okay, Josh, let me tell you
Please.
some of the things. First of all,
Please.
I would like everyone to review my issue about the what we call gauges or
Is this the one related issue right here?
Yeah. So
yeah, these are all related.
The delta for non-cumulative things. Delta for non-counters, what Prometheus calls counters. So the one of the problem, no matter what protocol we design, is we have to make sure that in our protocol, we can handle dropping of events or dropping of messages. So one of the example that I gave here was and I'm gonna talk in Prometheus world. If you have a gauge and you export deltas or changes for that gauge, and let's assume that gauge is the Q size, and you drop any of these delta, you will end up with the wrong current value in the gauge, which means any alerting you do on that thing, you will have big troubles and you will get fires. You may not get the alert fired when you should be, or you may get the alert fired when it shouldn't be. And I try to put down here a lot of the example, and I think StatsD was developed. StatsD has this support even for non-counters for what Prometheus called gauges, but I think StatsD did that with the mindset that actually they have always an agent. They're not gonna lose messages between the library and the agent. But if this protocol is used across different services, across multiple like long network connections and so on, I think it's very error prone to have deltas for things that you are interested in the current value, not things that you are interested in a rate of changes. So because for rate of changes, missing a delta is not that important. It's still, sure, you have a lag for a small period of time, but usually you will set up an alert over 5 minutes, not over every collection interval, so you can handle that. But for delta for these like up-down counters that we call, it's super error prone if you lose any of these messages. And I hope everyone agrees with me on this one. And I think I know even Open Metrics and even Prometheus are willing to allow you to send deltas for counters, but they are not willing to allow you to send deltas for gauges or changes for gauges, because the whole idea is that you are interested in the current value of a thing, and that current value has to not suffer of the problem of missing any messages.
For the scraping, as in Prometheus exposition format and open metric scraping, we only have the total value for the counters for precisely this. If you miss a delta, you have a loss of information. So we don't actually support deltas. That's one of the core things about the pull model.
Correct. Pull model may help, but even a pull model, Rich, I'm talking about if you don't go and collect for, let's say, 5 minutes, the library may drop some of these deltas. Let's say you produce it depends on the implementation on the library as well. But
yes, for the Prometheus and for the open metrics, you don't have a delta. You only have won't go away just on their own. You actively have to delete them if you want to delete them, but it's best practice to never ever delete a counter. This obviously puts some limits on the super high end of cardinality. If you have like a myriad of things which you want to count and then have long-lived processes, but that's the trade-off we made. That by default, nothing goes away, and we actually discourage anything from going away and always having the full counter. Of course, this also allows us to see counter resets happening, blah, 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 and doing the appropriate math on it.
Correct, but
also, just point of order, Callum is now here, who's part of Cortex, and if you have any remote read-write questions, we can jump back in the topic a little bit.
Okay.
Because I just asked him to join. I think Callum should be here.
Yes, he joined.
Yes, he's here. Perfect. So if you have remote read-write questions, we can jump back to those.
I just want to quickly add that I agree with the issue in general. I think if you're going to monitor a sum, the most reliable way to report that is as a sum. If you're going to monitor a rate or changes, then it's okay to export rates or to export changes. So there seems to be a distinction being drawn between up-down counter and counter. I think it's pretty artificial. Like if you want to monitor the rate of change of either instrument, you should monitor deltas, and if you should collect deltas. And if you want to monitor the sum, you should collect sums. And as I said earlier, the issue does boil down to a concern about high cardinality, and I'm willing to drop it, particularly because I think we can do something here with the exemplars and the sampling. This does end up looking almost exactly like the issue that was mentioned earlier at the beginning, which has to do with Prometheus and the Cortex Remote Write API. I don't know, Callum, if you'd like to introduce yourself. The question had to do with whether Cortex might ever support some sort of high availability cluster where the writes were deltas and Cortex was sort of doing the right thing, which is a hard problem. We recognize that.
Okay, sure. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that.
Well, what I'm trying to suggest is that today the Remote Write API is a list of timestamped cumulative values. And the way we've been looking at the OTLP protocol here, there are these deltas and there are these cumulatives. In both cases, you have a start time and a change in that sum since the start time. And if it's cumulative, that means the start time is sort of constant. And if it's delta, it means that the start time is the previous window's end time. For Cortex to help us, which I recognize as a very hard problem, the reports would start to look like deltas. They would say, this is the last point that I definitely reported, and here's the change since then. Or here are all the points with relative values since that point in time. In other words, the reset timestamp is part of the request. Then Cortex could potentially interleave parallel writes. And as long as there's a record for every start time that every delta arriving has, it could be done. Technically, it's a hard problem, and I don't want to make it sound easy.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, it could be. We don't really have any plans to do something like that because that's just not the way Prometheus does it, and Cortex is basically just reusing Prometheus components.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Rich, were you able to add the start time for counters and histograms inside the Prometheus or not yet?
They're in open metrics, so by definition, they're already in Prometheus for some time and also in the Python client library.
I see. So, Colin, I don't know if you know the open metrics and the new Prometheus format. We're gonna support this start time or reset time or whatever it is called. So that means you're gonna support it, or it means you need extra effort to support that?
Well, so as far as like remote write and Cortex is concerned, it has no notion of the exposition format. It's basically rereading Prometheus's write-ahead log and using that to generate data for remote write. So
yeah, that's our understanding too.
Yeah. So unless that format changes significantly, which I don't think it's really going to, we have some plans around like changing ordering of things as they're written to the write head log, and maybe introducing some new data types like exemplars, for example. But in terms of like changing how the data is actually written in terms of doing like this delta bit instead of the entire value for a counter, for example, I don't think we really have any plans to do something like that.
Can I ask a related Prometheus question? Someone we know. So it seems to me that if the Prometheus client is going to ever reset and send a new start time on its cumulative series, and the Prometheus server was to write to a remote write, there's not enough information there. Therefore, what could be done, I'm imagining, is when the Prometheus server sees a reset for some series, look up the old series by reading Cortex, figure out where that same series left off, and then begin appending. This requires Prometheus to have state. So I don't know that that actually works. Maybe I've just imagined something that can't be done.
I think we're currently mixing a few things. So the fact that remote read write will start supporting more metadata, that will happen. That's part of the Dev Summit results, and that obviously includes metadata like a start time. A counter reset is just detected by whatever the counter is, not being +0 or more. Like if it goes down by even 1, that's detected as a counter reset and handled as a counter reset. Having the literal same metric or time series name with a new time start time is an anti-pattern. Like I don't think we ever even talked about this case. Of course, from the Prometheus point of view, this is an absolute anti-pattern. If you have the same metric name, or sorry, the same time series name within a single target, being exporter, integration, what have you, that is always the same thing. Like it's literally the same identity. Even something going away is heavily discouraged, but something going away and something new reappearing with the same identity is an absolute anti-pattern, at least in Prometheus, and by extension, Thanos and Cortex and Open Metrics.
But I think Samir tripped you, and when he added the start time, there is no. So in Open Metrics, when you have start time, you have to respect that. And
I'm not saying you can't do this in Open Metrics, but I'm very much saying that there will definitely be no specific provisions for this within anything which is coming from the Prometheus ecosystem. Obviously, as you're receiving the data, you're free to do whatever on your end. Yes, absolutely, agreed. But that's orthogonal from anything happening or directly being supported within Prometheus. And with my Prometheus hat on, if we needed to make a change to support this specific use case, I don't think it would find consensus within Prometheus team. Of course, it is, at least for Prometheus, an anti-pattern.
Okay. So that being said, I think what I'm hearing from everyone for the moment is deltas may be problematic in a bunch of systems, but to be honest, there are backends like New Relic which expect deltas for some of these things. I know John or Tyler can jump and tell me, but I know for sure for some of the things they explicitly expect you to reset everything before the like whenever you export, reset, start from the beginning and do a new export every time.
Yeah, to
Datadog is in the same boat.
Yeah.
But aren't you mixing? I mean, the one thing is what you're doing in your library. The other thing is what you're sending on the wire. And in your library, you can retain deltas and you can reset everything every single time, or you can keep counters. In my opinion, having absolute values has better mathematical properties, but both basically works. And whichever you have, if your wire format requires the other thing, you need to recast it into the other thing anyway. Like that, it's just a matter of deciding what the library should be doing and what is better to be done within the library. I think, in my opinion or in my experience, the common case is that absolute counters are better, unless you're in super high cardinality, in which case it might be better to have an optional flag to pivot to deltas. But even if you do this for anything exporting open metrics or anything else which has absolute counters, you're basically getting rid of that state in your library. And then whatever is your glue code to export that stuff, be it a sidecar, be it another component of the library, it doesn't matter, needs to rebuild that state anyway. So you're not gaining any by throwing away that state.
We're in. That's the state we're in right now.
I'd like to remind people of John Watson's OTAP, OTAP 126, which I think is addressing exactly the scenario we're talking about.
That may be, so it may be a library problem, Richard, but it may also be an intermediate step problem. So imagine if you have the library talking to another binary which talks to the backend. Now, even though the library may do whatever we believe is the right thing, there is this intermediate step, and this is where we don't know between the library and this intermediate step, which is outside the process. If we go with absolute values, then in this intermediate step, Tyler for New Relic will have to calculate the deltas. If we go with deltas in this intermediate step, Prometheus will have to calculate absolute values. So
no.
Why not?
Prometheus cannot do this. There will be an exporter, or there will be an integration component to OpenTelemetry or what have you, but Prometheus itself can't do this. It already needs to be on the wire in the way which Prometheus understands, and that is the problem, that you will basically have a system somewhere which will be rebuilding the state anyway.
Yeah, that's the issue that we are running into, because that's fundamentally the functionality we are missing.
Correct.
So I'd like to interject here. I think we're circling around the same point. We understand now deltas are good sometimes and bad sometimes, vice versa for cumulatives. And the proposal that we started with is that OTLP can support both. All we need to do is talk about what's the default. And if there's no good default, things get more complicated. I don't want to have to talk to the server to say, what are you doing with this data before I know what my configuration is? And that leaves us, I think, in an not a great situation. I mean, I could imagine having an environment variable or a configuration flag, like in John's proposal. When you're going to send the data remotely, you need to know whether you'd prefer deltas or cumulatives, I think. And that is a reason why some exporters, if the exposition format supports both, may need configuration for this. It's still not great to think that we have to choose a default and it's going to be bad for half the users.
Yeah, that's a point. Any default that we use to export is going to be half of the user. If it's Prometheus, they're going to be happy. The other half, which are more like StatsD, New Relic, or other world, is not going to be happy. So,
but on that point though, in like the GoSig, the solution was to build into the SDK some sort of tooling that handled that if you asked for it to be cumulative, it's cumulative, and if you ask for it to be delta, it's delta. And sending it over the wire is one thing. I think that there's been some great points that are being made here about the correctness associated with that. But eventually in the collector, Bogdan, it feels like that should be a similar functionality that's implemented.
We will have that. We will have that. There is no question about that. So we started with the idea, let's drop entirely deltas. Josh was kind of throwing that idea. And what I'm trying to say is we cannot completely ignore them. Because if we want to be friendly with Prometheus and we want to be friendly with New Relic, we cannot ignore them. What we need to make sure is whenever we get to Prometheus, we go with absolute values. Whenever we go to New Relic, we go with deltas.
And as Tyler's saying, the Go SDK already has this configurability, and OTLP could be trivially changed with the Go code right now to just decide to export deltas by building that memory state up in the process and never forgetting things, as we've talked about. The question that Lolita's group is bringing to this conversation that started us off was, we'd like to have the same type of transformation or processing being done in the collector, because there are valid configurations. If you have a single agent, it's pretty trivial to have a processor in your agent that takes deltas and turns them into cumulatives and does it correctly. If you have a scalable pool, is when it gets hard. That's why we're talking about Cortex.
Yep.
Richard, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just to walk back, of course, and it feels a little bit like Groundhog Day, because we literally had those discussions both within Prometheus team and within Open Metrics, and this is why we arrived at exactly this problem or this solution. The point is, if you have a generic system, a generic library, and you don't know at the latest at start time of your process what system will be ingesting your data, by definition, you must keep the cumulative values somewhere. Of course, I mean, the only thing is, if the problem is this, you will be losing information if you just do deltas. So you need to have the absolute values somewhere to be able to expose them to a system which expects absolute values. You could, in theory, do a really evil hack where you just retain the deltas, and as soon as someone starts asking you for absolute values, you just start calculating artificial values. But A, this might be breaking a few use cases, and B, you don't know when that thing goes away. So I can basically DOS you by requesting cumulatives once, if you have a system which is built on just allowing deltas. So either you need to keep cumulative by default, or you need a flag to deliberately disable them, because else you will be having a bad time at some point.
Okay.
There is no way to like, you can't, if you throw away the data, it's gone. And you need it if you do absolute values.
Yeah.
I mean, everything that you say is amazing. And we do understand the following. There may be a case where the final exporter to the backend is not in the library. And here you are thinking about Prometheus, which is only talking to the library. But if the final exporter to the backend is not in our library, it's in an intermediate step. So you have the library talking to an intermediate step, and then talking to the final exporter. Now this problem becomes, and that's why I gave you this example of having this intermediate step, which in the library or in the source, you don't know. So what do you do in the source? You can say you go with cumulative, but actually if the exporter that you needs deltas for whatever reason, but this like New Relic, and this is configured in the intermediate step, you will produce deltas here, and you will produce cumulative if we go to always producing cumulative in the library, and then we'll revert them to deltas in the step. So it's an extra work, and people will not be happy. And maybe we're trying to solve a very complicated problem, but I think we have to keep this in mind. And I don't know whatever is the best solution, but I do understand all the points of absolute values are better. That's what I was trying to make there as a point, especially for gauges and for stuff like that. Even if it's a up-down sum, like a gauge that you do Q size and you do +1, -1, it's way better to keep the final state, because losing any delta will cause you, as you said, completely wrong values and so on.
I'd like to call time on this conversation. We're going in circles, and I don't know that we have any great answers other than require some configuration and choose a default that will upset people. Or I think we should all agree that this is one of those issues we should just think about for a week and talk about next time. If anyone doesn't mind, then there's this, I sort of want to leave some time at the end, so maybe we can try to make this quick. Bogdan and I both have proposals. Bogdan's raising his hand. Go ahead.
One thing, for the issue that is filed in the collector and for all these things, I would prefer to wait for the OTLP to be finished before we start implementing that. Please don't go right now PRs. So there is an issue in the collector to do this accumulation, aggregation, to transform deltas into cumulative and so on. Until we have the final protocol, it will be hard for me to accept something going and rechange to apply to the new protocol. So please.
Yeah, I've been encouraging. I've been talking with that group, and there is a thought experiment that needs to happen in context of the next conversation about these two proposals that we have. The thought experiment is: you're a collector, you're going to get data in, and you're going to put data out. If you're processing, so we need to understand what are the valid transformations before we can do this. So I think they're totally coupled, as you say. I think the link might be wrong here, but there are two proposals, and if you've been following along, you note that I had this out last week, and Bogdan has come up with another one. I want to say very clearly that Bogdan taught me a lot by reading through his proposal. I had made some errors, and so I have updated my proposal. I still like my proposal. I just want to say that clearly, but it was missing some things. So I basically rewrote all of the comments in the last day and a half, and I don't think we have time to read through them here, but the summary that I would give you all very briefly is that I still have 18 different real combinations of these temporality structure, and I'm now calling continuity, which is the property of being a snapshot or not. And they're all valid, and I've got ways of thinking about them that I'm starting to get comfortable with. I've documented all the most important distinctions here, and then I've updated the comments on these bits themselves a little bit based on my understanding. One of the things that I was missing in my prior proposal was this notion of instantaneous points, especially when do we compute histograms of instantaneous points? And I've just, in my understanding of this now, the snapshot property is the one that enables that. And you can see I've documented it. Now, that's my proposal. And I guess you could, if you step back, my proposal is basically that we will add this new thing called kind, which replaces temporality, and is sort of like descriptive quality that's just a field that tells you something about the metric, but doesn't change any of the data points. Now, Bogdan's proposal has less of the sort of complicated kind variable, but changes the data points. And there are ways in which these both accomplish our goals. I haven't conclusively finished evaluating either at the moment. And Bogdan, I'd like you to give you a chance to state the same in your words.
I'm not changing the data points. I'm changing. So right now in your proposal, you have a value type and kind, and I was struggling to understand exactly all these combinations, and I think that's one of the things that I asked you on the chat, and I don't know if you addressed that. Are these six values, value type? Valid for the 18 kinds?
Yeah.
Or not?
Yeah, and I've tried to add comments to address that. If we think in terms of the open telemetry instruments, there are 6 of them, and there are 3 temporalities, and those are the 18 combinations. But we've replaced the 6 instruments with these 2 variables, 3 of them and 2 of them.
But histogram, can histogram be adding all the 18? Can a histogram be all the 18 types or just some of them?
Yeah, so the new distinction that I came up with to help me get to this, and by the way, I just want to say that I'm not going to fight to the end on this, because there are many ways we could come up with a proposal here. But I came up with a new descriptive, if you will, for the value types themselves, and I think it's now I'm starting to think of a distinction between what I'm calling single value data points and multi-value data points. Histogram is a multi-value data point, whereas scalars are a single value data point. And when we add raw data points, those are also single value. So the question that I came up with is, when is it okay to have a single value data point? And when is it not okay to have a single value data point? And the only time I can think of it's not okay to have a multi-value data point is when you're instantaneous and continuous. Meaning these are not snapshots. These are not from a callback. these were individual moments in time. If you happen to have the same instant timestamp, it's a coincidence. It doesn't mean anything. So that you shouldn't be allowed to have a histogram if you're getting an instantaneous continuous variable. That was the only new kind of insight that I got. It doesn't mean I've answered all your questions, but I think it gave me some new understanding.
Yeah. So anyway, I started from there, and again, I have to reread because you updated this morning. So I spent a lot of time in doing the weekend and beginning of the week. But I started from the idea of we have 6 things. It was before 15, and I got like 60 combinations, and I looked at that and like, man, I'm not going to be able to process all these 16 combinations, all these 60 things. It's going to be very hard for me to know what to do with these values. And I gave you examples and aggregation. I call that aggregation of aggregation, which I put in the document, which was like, essentially, I'm starting from a raw measurement. I'm doing a sum, delta sum or something like that. And then I'm applying a histogram of these things. And I failed to understand which are the one of the 16 things I should choose for every of these things. So with that in mind, and maybe I'm not that smart and I don't know how to do it correctly, but with that in mind, I started from a different angle and from the fact that what this data represents as like point. And I found that if you open my PR here, yeah, I found that we have, if you go to the one-off definition, that's where it matters the most. After some histogram summary, yeah, type. So I found that we have, and again, comments are not updated. I was just trying to put together something. So I found that I have an ability of exporting raw measurements. Raw measurements meaning somebody does a +1 -1 on a up-down counter. Somebody does record latency, and this is the latency. Why do we support this? It's a good question. I think it's a thing that we should consider to support. The second thing was what I call gauges, or you can call them scalars or anything. The idea of this were somebody gives me, let's say, they pre-calculate a % of something, or they calculate a value that I don't know whatever formula they use to calculate this. So I have to be able to support these things as what I called gauges. And this may not happen that the user calls synchronously to me. It may happen that user gives me, let's say, CPU usage for every core, and they calculate % of per core from the total. It is no longer the raw value because there is an aggregation happening, but it produces a scalar. So, and I did not know whatever aggregation transformation they use. So I call them gauge, maybe a wrong term, maybe I just scalar is good enough. Then the next one is when user does a sum. For me, sum is, and I have my own concern about up-down sum to be represented as sum or not because of the issue that I filed. But this is mostly what counters are in Prometheus and stuff. So I know that this is an accumulation over time of things. So I know I can build in the backend, I can use temporality to determine like deltas, to calculate rates, to do the things like that. Then I have histograms. I'm exposing histograms, and then I'm exposing what we call summaries. And now if you go back to all of these things, everyone has a huge list of properties about these points, which tries to map what Josh does in the 60 values, but more focused like, this is a histogram, and here are the properties for that histogram. Or this is a sum, and here are the properties for this sum. Is monotonic, is not monotonic, it's delta, is cumulative, and all these properties based on this. So anyway, my approach was like, first describe the data, and then the properties of the data. I felt like in Josh's case, that combination was a bit harder to understand.
Yeah, I would add, I think you're right. There's something a little bit more difficult to grasp about my proposal. And but in the for example of the distinction here is that I want us to have in my proposal one scalar value. It can be a sum if it's an adding kind of structure, and it can be a gauge if it's a grouping kind of structure. And that I should always be able to figure out what I got based on the values of the kind. And that the data points should always sort of stand on their own as data points. You should be able to strip the kind away. All you've got are numbers. If that's all you want, it's fine. But the kind tells you something about how you got here. So I think if we keep talking about this, we'll run out of time for the other issues. And I think the two of you and I talking is not going to help anybody. We should get others to read through this and think critically about it, I think. But this is really urgent. We got to move forward. This can't sit for that long. So, so I think we need more people to familiarize themselves with the issues.
Yeah, I haven't caught up on the latest, but my plan is to hopefully read into this more. I agree that maybe you two talking about it's not going to progress the issue, but I agree. I'd encourage everyone else to call also weigh in on this, because as Josh has pointed out, this is really critical.
And we're stuck right now as far as not having a collector and not being able to like help the team working with Cortex can't move forward on a processor and so on. It's just like really tricky. Okay, so, and I think I didn't expect the conversation about cumulative to last so long, but we didn't find a great solution there, and these are not entirely unrelated either. I think we need to give time to Justin, who's been taking over a couple of issues that are like moving a lot slower than we'd like, and there's some confusion. Justin, do you want to give us an update?
Yeah, okay. So we had my proposal from like a month ago about semantic conventions for timed operations, is like how to create golden metrics out of spans. Some of it kind of hinges on how we describe error conditions. And so while we were really close to a resolution on it, things were kind of blown up because the errors SIG has started rethinking how they're going to describe errors. I didn't attend the errors meeting this morning, but I got a recap from our representative who did. It's actually moving in a direction that I really like, where the instrumentation will try to only apply objective information to spans about like what occurs during a span, and it won't try to make any judgment calls about whether that situation is an error. So I'm really liking that. There's also, I think actually it was Bogdan's suggestion that we like strip out things that we are unsure of before GA, so that we can easily add them back in later, because removing things will be much harder down the road. So kind of given all of this, where I'm currently at on our proposal for making metrics out of spans. I think that maybe in our generic semantic conventions, we shouldn't include something like a status, and we should defer that right now to the category specific semantic conventions. So like for HTTP, we'll put the HTTP status code in the semantic convention. For gRPC, we'll put that status code in. And we can kind of solve those on a case-by-case basis without coming up with this abstraction for status that tries to cover every case. Unless there are objections, I think I'm gonna make those changes to that PR, and then we can move forward that way.
Then are we proposing an error equals true false bit as well as just whatever semantic conventions you have? And does it matter if there's only one of those semantic conventions set, or is that again interpretive and non-objective?
I believe that's interpretive, and I don't think that instrumentation should be responsible for putting an error equals true false. I actually think this is a good candidate for something like a views API, a metric view. You could describe your own error conditions and apply your own Booleans if you wanted to.
Cool. I support that.
So by the way, I was in the meeting and I pushed a lot for them to move and think about GA goal. And indeed, what I told everyone was error equals true is very subjective. And we should not have it for the moment. We should have only facts. Facts being this was an HTTP code 200, leave it there, and we can define later mapping to errors, not errors and stuff.
I like the idea that the views API answers this question for us. Just put in whichever statuses you have and define a view for your error conditions, I guess. But to do that in the client is going to be a tricky bit of code, and I'd rather not. So I think it's going to end up that the collector will be tasked with, you know, implementing this more complicated views eventually. That's probably what will happen. Justin, then the next, I think that that's uncontroversial actually, but it's really a question for that group. Now the question was really about what was intended by 657, and I think there are reasonable disagreements about interpretation there. You want to tell us what you think?
Yeah, okay, so my intention, which I recognize is only one view here, but my intention was that this PR would describe how an instrumentation provider would create metrics, what semantics to use for metrics like that are based off of spans. I really like the direction that John took it. John Watson put together like an abstraction that timed an operation and created both a span and a metric, or incremented a value recorder at the same time. So this was my intention. I certainly want something upstream of the collector because I think it's very important that we get this information before the effects of sampling have taken place.
So to answer your things, the happening before collector in the library, it's a library change and it's independent of semantic conventions. And that's one of the things that we pointed there is that you cannot add subtle things in the semantic conventions that imply us to change API. You have to make a proposal to change the API to support this if you want. From semantic convention perspective, I think that reference should not exist. It's like, if you have the span, this is how you produce the metric. Doesn't matter how we get the span, doesn't matter how we get sampling, not sampling, that's a separate discussion. It's more like, at least for me, if you call this a semantic conventions, this is what I'm hearing. If you call this an OTAP, which allows you to propose different changes in other places, I'm fine with it. But as just a semantic convention, I'm not happy to see that this has points to other changes that, again, they should be addressed independent. I think for me, when I read the semantic convention, is either am I the person who adds these informations to the span? Here is what I should follow. Am I consumer of this span? Here is what I should follow. Doesn't matter how the span is produced and stuff. Again, not saying that we don't need a change in the API. It's just like, I don't know if semantic convention is the right place to propose these changes.
When I originally read this, I kind of thought, well, what we want is a semantic convention for naming any metric that measures a duration, which is a very simple statement and says nothing about spans. But it does carry implications. If you're going to generate a metric from a span, it should follow the same pattern. And that was all it needed to say, in my opinion. I think Justin's ambition was a little greater, and I don't disagree with having sort of a stronger recommendation or more specific recommendation for naming metrics derived from spans that still follow that first pattern, which is end in dot duration. But the greater pattern might, share some category naming with the metric. I guess I had hoped that the broad language of OTEP 108, which says, how you should name metrics, would cover that category and stuff, so that we don't need to say anything more than you have a metric measuring duration, call it dot duration.
Okay.
But that's just my feeling. It's not, it doesn't matter.
And the other thing is, is, should these metrics be, for example, calculated offline or online? Like, should we calculate these metrics while the spans are produced, or is this, I mean, there are a bunch of things that we can discuss about this. From the semantic convention, it shouldn't matter where you do it. This is the data you should produce. Now, when you come to where do we do it, how do we do it, it's a different thing. It's from semantic convention, for me, it shouldn't say how, it should say what we produce, what we do, what we make. Anyway,
okay.
That was my understanding. And again, it can simply be two separate issues. One that explains the data that we want to produce, and one that explains how do we produce this data. And as two different things, I'm happy. Go ahead, George. I see you disagree with that.
I don't know. I want to call time on this conversation as well. I think Justin has enough information to go back and revise it, I guess, or, you know, I'm not sure, but there are two items left here, and I want to get a little bit of both of them. Can I skip ahead of Chris's item and just make sure to answer the last one? OTLP is our biggest problem right now. We have some debate, and I feel that we're close, and I want to make sure that we don't just like introduce artificial delays. Like, we got to focus on that, those proposals. Like, nothing else matters right now, because we can't get to GA if we don't get a protocol that we think is going to work. So I don't know when it's going to stabilize. We don't have like command and control here. I can't just do it. We got to have agreement, and it's hard. So all I know is that I wish it was done like a month ago. And I've been working as hard as I can, or as fast as I can, but it's just where there's confusion here. I hope that's enough on that. I don't know a better answer. If anyone has another one on when we can GA this or how we can get out of this debate, I'm open to it. Otherwise, I'd like Chris to discuss. Chris has not been here in a while, but we have a couple of views.
Can I ask a question? I need some part of his brain from Richard. What do you do differently between gauge histogram and histograms in Prometheus? It's very important for me to understand because related to OTLP. Do you do anything differently, and how do you treat them?
I am spontaneously not aware of gauge histograms, but obviously we can, in theory, do this.
I think gauge delta is also, I've confessed, have had trouble finding the source of truth on this topic. This notion of a gauge delta is like hard to find.
No, gauge histogram
gauge delta doesn't exist.
Gauge histogram was in proto in the open metrics. Did it get removed?
I actually need to, no, wait. I need to look up that part. We didn't write it down in the spec, like not in the condensed version yet. Yeah, we had use cases for stuff like decibel, and so I'll get back to you on that one.
Please. It's very important for me to understand what you do differently with them. I know the use cases. I'm more curious, what are you going to do it in the backend? How do you consume them differently? Thanks.
Ideally, just drop me an email, and yeah, that's probably best.
Can you take that on, Bogdan? Okay. Well, there's a minute. I don't know. Does anyone want to talk about views?
I can just say as a quick FYI, we've got a couple of internships that are ending, and I know I've been out of this for long enough now that I'm missing a bunch of important context, but I basically just wanted to check that we could continue with the exemplars work that Connor put up in the OTAP. This depends a little bit on the views prototype, and so I just want to make sure that we're not actually blocked by the views spec.
I don't want any intern to be blocked. I wish I could say that they shouldn't be at all. I love the exemplars proposal. The OTAP the PR 159 in the proto, I would change nothing about it. It's just that it feels like it should be blocked behind this other more big question about OTLP kind or whatever it is. That's the only reason it's blocked. I think it's going to land as is, or I hope it is. And I said this every time it comes up. This is like, to me, this is the most exciting thing that we can do here, because exemplars with statistical sampling give us a way to expose high cardinality without memory requirements. That's it's a promise, and I know it can be done. There's a question of how we're going to get this in the open source world. I've actually been asking my employer if I can open source something. I'm hopeful, but it's very exciting, and I don't want to block the interns.
Okay, great. Yeah, so what we can try and do then is just go ahead with exemplars in the in Connor's Python prototype. It's possible this will include some stuff from the views prototype that gets changed in the future, but I think it's not the end of the world if we have slightly different views implementations in Go and Python right now.
As long as you make sure that it's called experimental, called not stable, or whatever, I would strongly encourage you to do that, because it proves us it's working. It's better than you can imagine. So please do that. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, will do. Thanks.
So Josh, just in ending, even our interns are blocked. So therefore, would you be able to give us a clearer answer on the OTLP proposals by next week?
Are you blocked by the aggregation?
Yes.
By the way, talking about aggregation, can you look, there is another Google intern who does a processor for aggregation inside.
Right. We are looking at that. We are collaborating, but it's slightly different. I mean, aggregation.
We've talked about how if the client goes to cumulative reporting, the collector processor is not a blocker for you. I still think there's interest in having a processor that can do delta to cumulative or cumulative delta, but we just discussed it for half an hour. It's problematic.
Yeah.
So I would recommend there's going to be some way to tell the client, if not by default, which I think probably will be the default, that you should get cumulative counters. And so Cortex will just work. And so I don't think we should be blocking that project on OTLP.
Okay. So you think that we should just add that functionality to the collector?
I would say we should not worry about converting deltas to cumulatives in the collector, and proceed with as much of the project as we can. Because if we go forward with changing the default to report cumulatives from client libraries, it'll just work, and you won't have to worry about this processing question.
Yeah, that's true.
We will still need that functionality, but
yeah, but we're just trying to unblock the Cortex project.
Yeah, I think to the point Josh is trying to make is just assume that it'll eventually get built and that it will work. And then
okay.
Yeah, I sort of in general think this protocol, all these variations that we're talking about are like, they better be compatible or better be transformable into one another. Like if you were to code with one of the drafts that we have and then realize that we made changes later, I doubt it will be a big disruptive change. So I would encourage speculative progress at this point, although I don't like it. It's the best we have.
Sounds good.
Okay, but everyone, please give your opinions on these OTEPS proposals. I'm going to keep studying it because I haven't finished writing the most convincing case for it either. And as I mentioned to you all, there's this thought experiment of how would I write the processor given these 18 kinds. So that's sort of like one of the ways I will be analyzing this. Okay, we're out of time. Thank you all. I'm sorry we aren't moving faster, and we'll keep trying. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.